Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to 1.4, which is very hard to pronounce name-wise, but is also as equally complicated as as this is a new unit, or a new subunit. So this is what we call Vibarinzaiststism, okay? And you may be asking, Professor, what the fuck? How are you supposed to pronounce this, and what is this even about? Alright? And once I write this long word down, then we can start discussing the actual properties of what this is. So, before we go in, we got to talk about the major concept of Vibarinzaistism, which is the study on how environments distort cognition, identity, truth, and logic. Vibarinzaistic is the MJNist principle that its perception is not stable. It bends, warps, and reshapes itself based on its surroundings. So, a key idea here to put down is that Vibarinzaistism is never linear or stable. So there is bound to be some sort of distortion. Now, in a way, there is going to be stabilism, but that is not Vibarinzaism. The theory claims that you are never thinking the same way. The theory claims that you're never thinking the same way in two different environments, even if you believe you are. So this explores three domains: cognitive disorientation fields, perceptual drift, and environmental logic. And these three, this is how the distortion works. So we're going to talk about the first one here, which is cognitive distortion fields. So we like to just call this CD fields. Alright, CD's fields. So it is how the environment actively bends in cognitive function. And as we know, cognitive function is how the mind works. So cognitive distortion field describes setting physical or emotional that wrap the mind's inner calculations. They function like gravitational fields. The closer you are, the more your thinking bends. So, spatial warping is physical locations alter emotions. So, it's judgment based on your surroundings. So, this is the most practical concept. This is the most practical concept, and it's a base. So, key ideas. A crowded hallway triggers different threat detection than an empty one. Proximity to authority, teachers, parents, and leaders changes risk-taking behaviors. Corners, open areas, and tight spaces or unfamiliar rooms create processing distortions. So if you think about it, your environment connects to your emotions. If you're on a beach, right, that's going to be different from when you're in the middle of the ocean. They're two separate ideas. And that's the whole point, is that nothing is truly fully aligned. The mind does not think globally, it thinks locationally. So that is what spatial warping is. And in this concept, it's more just environmental stuff. It's not technically about emotions or triggering emotions. In fact, it's just the mind and how it works. Alright, 1.2 is emotional saturation. High emotion environments overload logical pathways, causing emotional thought to dominate. So emotions over logic. So think of a place like a hospital or a concert. The hospital is gonna make you stressed out because there's a lot of things happening. You may have someone in there. So it's truly based on that. Concerts, high crowded area, but there's music performing, so you're having fun, and that's where emotion dominates over actual reasoning. So it's all dependent on that, and the effects can be reduced analytical accuracy, heightened symbolic thinking, increased impulsivity, and amplification of minor stimuli into major threats or comforts. All right, now we get into 1C. Sorry, did I write 2B here? That's my mistake. This is 1B. And environment, and this is called suggestibility zones. Okay? Don't mind my handwriting. Just deal with it, okay? And suggestibility zones states that environments that increase belief acceptance, compliance, and lowered skepticism those are what the zones are. So let's take, for instance, you have a low lighting group, so very dim lights, and a very highly bright room. Okay? The mind becomes temporarily rewired in accepting ideas that they would normally reject. You don't want to go here. You want to go here because you're more visible. However, this could have the pot of gold, and this could have something lethal. So you really gotta interpret the suggestion zone very well. And A is probably going to be on the exam the most, but these two other concepts are branches of those ideas. So B is perpetual drift. Okay? Or perceptual drift. And it's how the identity slowly reshapes itself through long-term environment exposure. Perceptual drift claims identity is not fixed. It is gradually redrawn by repeating surroundings. It is not a sudden break, but a slow gravitational pull. If that doesn't make sense, I'll explain it a little bit more as we progress. So, 2A, slow identity shift. This is small, repeated environmental pressures that reshape your beliefs. So, moving in a fast-paced city. More anxiety, but it's more efficient. Healthcare workers, they become desanitized to trauma, but they still have to experience it. So, it's, in a sense, we're combining two different ideas. We're progressively going forward, and there's some sort of opposition, which is what we refer to in the opposition laws. The opposition laws. Okay, sorry if that was a little unclear. Now we get to 3B. Nah, not 3B. Shoot. Now we get to, if this thing would work with me, 2B, which is contextual conditioning. And it's basically, definition is identity becomes environment specific. The self fragments into contextual selves. Speaking differently at home with friends, more discipline at the gym, quiet in library, philosophical thoughts at night. I'm going to increase my mic volume. All right. That should be good. So basically, the implication is identity is modular, not unified. So identity becomes environment specific. So you become one with your environment. You have to be quiet in a library, or else they're going to kick you out. You have to be thinking at night because it's a quiet environment. That is what shapes you. Now here's the drift threshold, okay? One of my favorite topics to go over, and it's the point where small perceptual changes accumulate to a major cognitive transformation. That seems a little, you may be asking, MJ, that seems really complicated. How are we supposed to interpret this? Well, pretty simple, okay? the point where small perceptual changes accumulate in a major cognitive transformation. So think about it like this. There's one whole threshold. So before this threshold, this will be the before and this will be the after. Okay? You have, I'm still me. That's what you're going to stay. I'm still myself and I believe in myself. After the threshold, I don't recognize myself anymore. It's sudden moral reevaluations of yourself. And it's loss of former interests, reinterpretation of memories. It's a complete change. And that is what the threshold is. The core idea is crossing the drift threshold is one of the major transformations. It's changing inside the threshold. All right? We have one more to go over, and that is environmental logic.